In Crime and Punishment, the character of Razumikhin is Raskolnikov's dear friend, and Razumikhin is extremely loyal to Raskolnikov. And as Raskolnikov goes through the fallout, the aftermath from his murder, he goes through a period of illness where he can't get out of bed, a kind of depression and brain fog, and the responses to trauma where he withdraws from his family. He becomes very closed off from the world and quite mean. And through all of this, Razumikhin is loyal to him and kind to him and always thinks the best in his friend. And there's a scene towards the end of the book where Raskolnikov says to Razumikhin, "I'm parting ways with you." He says, "I leave my sister Donya to your keeping. I know you love her. Take good care of her." And he refuses to tell Razumikhin why. This is only one episode in a long chain of Raskolnikov shutting people out, withdrawing, being secretive. And so Razumikhin, we're told, stood lost in thought and excitement, making a silent conclusion. He's a political conspirator. He must be. And he's on the eve of some desperate step. That's certain. It can only be that. End quote. And so this is sort of a comedic line. It's the incredible way in which Razumikhin always imagines the best intentions in his friend Raskolnikov. And he concludes that the reason Raskolnikov is being so secretive, and so you might even say cruel to his friends, is because he's a political conspirator. And this has resonances with Dostoevsky's biography, because the author Dostoevsky himself was convicted for being a political conspirator. He was involved in some reading groups in his mid and early 20s in Russia under Tsar Nicholas I, who was a very paranoid and oppressive ruler at the time. And in some of these reading groups, he sort of happened to get roped in, sort of incidentally, with some more conspiratorial, revolutionary elements in Russian society at the time. Dostoevsky himself was not much of a revolutionary, but he did become associated with these groups, incidentally. And as a result, he was informed upon, and his whole group was arrested. There was a period of months where there was some sort of a trial. Eventually, this whole group was taken out to Semyonov Place in St. Petersburg in December 1849. Dostoevsky is 28 at the time, and they are taken out to be shot, executed by firing squad. And Dostoevsky is blindfolded. He's tied up along with his companions, his friends. He stands waiting for the shots to ring out, and in the last moment, his sentence is commuted, and he's saved from this execution, the letter of pardon from the Tsar, and instead his sentence is commuted to be hard labor in Siberia for a period of years. And of course, this traumatic moment, this episode in Dostoevsky's life, has tremendous echoes and reverberations throughout all of Dostoevsky's later writing, which include his great classic works. In the beginning of The Idiot, the protagonist, Prince Mishkin, joins his hosts in St. Petersburg, and the conversation they have goes in the direction of an incident that Prince Mishkin had seen. He had seen a guillotine, and he talks about the ethics of the guillotine, the barbarity, basically, of this form of punishment. He says, here, in the case of the guillotine, and he's comparing it to other forms, to torture, on the other hand, he says, here, I imagine the most terrible part of the whole punishment is not the bodily pain at all, but the certain knowledge that in an hour, then in 10 minutes, then in half a minute, then now, this very instant, your soul must quit your body, and that you will no longer be a man. And that is certain. Certain. That's the point. The certainty of it. Just that instant, when you place your head on the block, and you hear the iron grate over your head, then that quarter of a second is the most awful of all. End quote. And this touches on a theme in Dostoevsky's writing, and his writing that echoes, that draws from his experience in front of the firing squad. The way in which time is transformed in the moment of death. When you look over that precipice and you look into the abyss of nothingness and you see the dissolution of everything you know, the dissolving of your entire reality, your brain, corporeal brain trying to wrap itself around what it means to not exist and failing because it's an infinite paradox. This peering into the total nothingness of the end of story, the end of the entire arena, theater where everything happens, what that does to you, the sense of vertigo, and the way in which time feels so intense. The certain knowledge that in an hour, then in 10 minutes, then in half a minute, then now, this very instant, your soul must quit your body and you will no longer be a man. Mishkin continues, quote, "You may place a soldier before a cannon's mouth in battle and fire upon him, and he will still hope. But read to that same soldier his death sentence, and he will either go mad or burst into tears. Who dares to say that any man can suffer this without going mad?" And then Dostoevsky references quite literally his own experience here, continuing, "Doubtless, there may be men who have been sentenced, who have suffered this mental anguish for a while, and then have been reprieved. Perhaps such men may have been able to relate their feelings afterwards." End quote. In Crime and Punishment, there's a scene fairly early in the book, after the murder, where Raskolnikov is in a bar, and he's sitting with a police officer in the bar. And Raskolnikov has a thought. He says, quote, "Where is it," thought Raskolnikov, "where is it I've read that someone condemned to death says or thinks an hour before his death that if he had to live on some high rock, on such a narrow ledge, that he'd only room to stand, and the ocean, everlasting darkness, everlasting solitude, everlasting tempest around him, if he had to remain standing on a square yard of space all his life, 1,000 years, eternity, it were better to live so than to die at once. Only to live and live, life, whatever it may be. How true it is, good God, how true. Man is a vile creature, and vile is he who calls him vile for that." End quote. That observation from Crime and Punishment reminds me of a scene in a short story, a play by Hanoch Levine called The Child Dreams. And in this scene here, you have a ship full of refugees, and they're escaping persecution. They're seeking asylum, and they show up on an island asking for a safe passage onto the island. And the governor of the island comes out, and he says, "I'm sorry, we have no more room for you on our island." The passengers beg. They say, "Mr. Governor, here are refugees requesting solid ground to walk on. Not to live, Mr. Governor, just not to die. Not to die. On the side, in the corners of the island, in a little camp, crowded, dense, we won't take up any room. A crust of bread. Don't even need anything to spread on it. Without anything to spread on it, Mr. Governor." Skipping, another passenger. "How to convey to you, Mr. Governor, how afraid I am to die. How to convey, with what thread to tie from man to man, afraid to die." The governor says, "Yes, the fear of dying. The fear. Who doesn't know the fear of dying? We shall pray for you." The excited passenger. "Without anything to spread on it, Mr. Governor." The governor. "We shall pray for you. We shall pray for all the inhabitants of this earth, who, as they tumble into the grave, are willing to give up something to spread on it." Towards the end of the Brothers Karamazov, there's a court case, and the defendant is Dmitry Karamazov, and he's a defendant. He's being accused of murdering his father, and part of the mystery, the strangeness of the case, is that shortly after the murder, Dmitry went on this amazing partying spree, and he spent money extravagantly in a tavern. And the prosecuting attorney has this job of sort of explaining Dmitry's behavior. And so he gives the following explanation. He says, quote, "I imagine that he felt something like what criminals feel when they are being taken to the scaffold. They have another long, long street to pass down, and at a walking pace, past thousands of people. Then there will be a turning into another street, and only at the end of that street, the dread place of execution. I fancy that at the beginning of the journey, the condemned man, sitting on his shameful cart, must feel that he has infinite life still before him. The houses recede. The cart moves on. Oh, that's nothing. It's still far to the turning into the second street, and he still looks boldly to right and to left at those thousands of callously curious people with their eyes fixed on him, and he still fancies that he is just such a man as they. But now the turning comes to the next street. Oh, that's nothing, nothing. There's still a whole street before him, and however many houses have been passed, he will still think there are many left, and so to the very end, to the scaffold." End quote. This compression of time, this compression of experience, this awakening of additional kind of sensitivity to the passage of time, the ability to find the infinite, the eternity that exists from moment to moment. Because everything is so compressed, because you're peering over the abyss, you're seeing the end of story, the end of the whole arena in which the play of consciousness happens. A little later on in The Idiot, Prince Mishkin tells a story that he heard. And this story is probably one of the most autobiographical accounts we get from Dostoevsky about his experience facing the firing squad. He says, quote, "I once heard the story of a man who lived 12 years in prison. I heard it from the man himself. He was one of the persons under treatment with my professor. His life in prison was sad enough. His only acquaintances were spiders and a tree that grew outside his grating." Skipping, "There was a very strange feature in this case, strange because of its extremely rare occurrence. This man had once been brought to the scaffold in the company with several others, and had the sentence of death by shooting passed upon him for some political crime. 20 minutes later, he had been reprieved, and some other punishment substituted. In the interval between the two sentences, 20 minutes, or at least a quarter of an hour, had been passed in the certainty that within a few minutes he must die." So Prince Mishkin retells this testimony, which of course is identical to the experience of Dostoevsky in his own life. So skipping a bit, quote, "He said that those 5 minutes seemed to him to be the most interminable period, an enormous wealth of time. He seemed to be living in these minutes so many lives that there was no need as yet to think of the last moment, so that he made several arrangements, dividing up the time into portions. One for saying farewell to his companions, 2 minutes for that, then a couple more for thinking over his own life and career and all about himself, and another minute for a last look around. He remembered having divided his time like this quite well. While saying goodbye to his friends, he recollected asking one of them some very usual everyday question, and being much interested in the answer. Then, having bade farewell, he embarked upon those 2 minutes, which he had allotted to looking into himself. He knew beforehand what he was going to think about. He wished to put it to himself as quickly and clearly as possible, that here was he, a living, thinking man, and that in 3 minutes he would be nobody. He thought he would decide this question once for all in these last 3 minutes. A little way off there stood a church, and its gilded spire glittered in the sun. He remembered staring stubbornly at this spire, and at the rays of light sparkling from it. He could not tear his eyes from these rays of light. He got the idea that these rays were his new nature, and that in 3 minutes he would become one of them, amalgamated somehow with them. End quote. And that's such an incredible description of what it's like to face death in that way. The narration of Prince Mishkin continues, and he describes that this character told him that his biggest fear in that moment would be what would happen if he were to survive. What would happen if he had to carry this awareness, this sense of time, this sense of the infinite that exists in every moment with him for a lifetime? What would happen? How would he live his life if he were to survive this? And then the interlocutors, the people listening to Prince Mishkin's story says, well, he survived. So what did he do with his life? How did he take advantage of the time he was given? And Prince Mishkin answers, of course he squandered it. He did nothing with it. He lived his life like everyone else. People often ask if reading literature can make us better people. And I think as I've grown more and gone older and maybe read more, I've become more and more skeptical of the possibility that literature makes us better people. But if there's any chance that literature can improve us, it can be in a sensitivity for the experience of people who are afraid for their lives. It could be in a sensitivity to the experience of the refugee and the asylum seeker and the immigrant and the people living under bombardment in war zones, unable to leave, who would do anything for safety. And if literature can't give us that sensitivity and can't make us attuned and conscious of those experiences that are going on in the world today and make us more empathetic and aware and motivated to do better, then surely literature does not make us better people.